Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining me. As I say, we have to just double check every time now because there was an issue previously to make sure that everything's running successfully. I'm doing this Facebook Live from home this evening, so I've got one of my favourites with me here. So as always, if you've got any questions, please do raise them as we go along and I'll deal with them towards the end. We will have a subject matter that I'm dealing with today as a result of the poll, which was assisting and advice for first time buyers. Which I will be going through in more detail. Just to start off with, I wanted to remind people in case they weren't aware of where I've come from, what I'm doing. So basically, I'm a qualified lawyer, qualified twice, currently working towards my masters as well. Specialist in property and private clients, so wills and powers of attorney. Residential and commercial conveyancing, anything really that you need assistance with. So over the last couple of weeks I've been expanding quite a lot on my social media, so you'll see that I've got Twitter pages and I've now also added to my collection the YouTube channel, so any of the videos that you need you'll be able to like and share them from there. From the last Facebook Live, I did something about the intestacy rules, so I've done a flowchart which is on all of my social media, and I've also done a blog as well from the website of that, so if you're interested on what happens when you haven't got a will, that's the information there. I've also had quite a lot of good feedback about the stamp duty land tax flowchart that I prepared. That's quite good if you really don't have an indication. It's quite good to have a look at that, and then it will give you an indication of what you're likely to pay. So this week we ran a poll, and the winner was to give advice about first time buyers about things that they should consider when they're looking at buying a property. So just to give an indication, there are a number of different things you need to look at when you're buying a property, but as a first time buyer you clearly don't have any sort of guidance on what to go on. So what I've done is I've sort of put together some information which you will potentially need to know or potentially not need to know when you're buying your first property. So it can be a very daunting experience, and there's lots of things to sort out, like surveys, legal advice, estate agents, everything like that, and all the fees associated with it. So the first thing to do is to make sure that everyone's off to the right start, is just make sure that you've checked your finances and done all of the calculations. So you need to take into consideration things like stamp duty, searches, land registration fees, conveyancing costs and things like that. It's very worthwhile doing the figures and doing them again and doing them again, because it can be extremely stressful if at the end of the transaction you get to the point where you just haven't got quite enough money and you're having to borrow from relatives or whatever. So in order to make sure that the process runs smoothly once you found a property to purchase, you should probably consider communicating clearly with your legal advisor what your proposed timescales are. Now, you can have a thought that it may be done within a certain amount of time, but the reality is every transaction is different, and realistically if you put your timescales forward initially, then everyone knows it's got a bit of focus and you can all aim towards the same goal. So timescales is really, really important, and also it's important if you've got specific things that you need to have as part of the transaction. So if you have a property's got a certain view, for example, you would want to check there's going to be no planning permission carried out in that area that would then restrict your view. You also want to make sure that if there's specific items that the sellers have said they're going to leave, that they're also included in the transaction as well, and that you're not paying additional amounts for them. So these are all things that right at the outset that you should probably consider asking and making sure that you are aware whether or not they're included, that kind of thing. If you make everyone aware of what you're after and what you're trying to achieve, it makes the whole process a lot simpler. People aren't mind readers, but as you are new to the whole process, you might not be aware to raise it. But it's always good to raise anything that you're considering rather than leaving it to last minute. So the type of advice that a lawyer will provide to you is generally the legal aspects involved in purchasing the house or the flat or whatever. There's different types of property, and they should indicate to you what is included, what's excluded, all the rights relating to the boundaries, if there's been any planning permissions, if there's any additional points that you need to be aware of, any potential ongoing financial obligations. They probably won't advise you on anything to do with the building structure or anything along those lines. That's the surveyor's job. They may well advise you on the survey, but it's not something that they will need to bring up first. They also can't advise you whether any of the appliances are working, any of the plumbing, heating, electrics, anything like that. That's something that you would need to investigate separately. They will, of course, guide you in making those suggestions, but it's not something that would automatically be raised by them. It's also worth considering, whilst you're going through the legal process, if you've got any potential future building works that you want to carry out, it's always worth asking if it's going to be advisable or achievable to do those, because there are some times where restrictive covenants prevent you doing things, or if there's planning permission restrictions and things like that. So if you can identify your future projects, it will assist in the process. So previously I mentioned about a survey. Now, although the lawyer doesn't deal with the survey, they will always recommend you have one. So there's 3 basic types of survey. There's a lender's valuation report, and that's carried out by your mortgage lender. But basically, they don't do an in-depth survey. They will just guarantee that the money they're loaning you is adequate against the property value. So that's really the only purpose of that. It can't strictly be relied upon because the contents aren't adequate enough. So what you would need to potentially consider is either upgrading your survey, which most lenders will do, or to get an entirely different survey carried out. And the main one is called a home buyer's report, and that will go into more detail about the property as a whole, the building, any extensions, structure. It will raise if there's any significant issues. If you had any substantial concerns about the structure, then you would be recommended to have a full structural survey. That goes into extreme detail. They drill small holes into the wall, but it's very expensive. So if you don't need that type of survey, it's best not to go for that. The home buyers is about middle ground that would be beneficial for most people in the first time buyer position. So the type of things that you should be checking for yourself when you're looking at a property, they're kind of common sense steps. You have to remember that any conveyancer, any lawyer, or most people involved don't actually visit the property. So we're kind of in your hands really to advise of anything that might necessarily need to be raised. So in order to do this, it's quite practical to go back to the property a number of times, at different times, different weathers, all sorts of different reasons. There's no harm in going back to the property. Most people will let you come back as much as you want. But the reason is, it will give you, the first time you go and see it, you'll just fall in love with it. The second time you will see more practical issues, and the third times you might see things like rights of way, things like that. So for example, if there's a big green space to the rear of the property or even to the front, that could be used either in due course for planning, a big development, or it could potentially also have a play park, children's play park, could have a right of way for public. There could be a number of things that you aren't aware of, but if you draw this to the attention of the conveyancer, they can make further inquiries for you. So it's also good to look for things like cracks in the wall, any sort of damp marks, things like that. It's not the be all and end all. Very, very often it doesn't mean anything whatsoever, but the issues can't be raised unless you draw them to someone's attention. So it's always good to, query these things at least. At the end of the day, you're in the first position. It's the biggest substantial purchase that you'll ever make in your whole life, and it's important to get it right. So most people will guide you through it. If the conveyancer can't help you, the surveyor can. If the surveyor can't, the estate agent can. There's a number of different people who will help you throughout the process. it's also good to go back to the property at different times. So, for example, even if you don't go into the property, it's good to go to the area. So you might see if there's any significant issues relating to parking or noise or neighbours, things like that. So that's always advisable. The most important thing for you to check is to check that the plan that you get given reflects the property you're purchasing. So sometimes things can be missed off, like a parking space, parts of a garden, things like that. And it's really important that you identify that, having been to the property. If your conveyancer's local, they will probably attend with you if necessary. It's not done all the time, but I've been to many properties, and if there is anything that you're really not sure of, it can be done. So don't be afraid to ask. As I say, at the end of the day, it's such a substantial purchase that you really need to make sure you're doing it. And even if you've committed, you're not actually obliged to proceed with the transaction until exchange of contracts. So if something comes up in the course of the matter, sometimes you have to think, is it worth losing the few £100s that you've already spent on the survey and searches, rather than commit yourself to a substantial burden of a property that isn't quite for you, or that you've got concerns about or issues with. Moving home needs to be very exciting, especially your first home. The last thing you want to do is move in with something already hanging over you, so it's really important to raise. And as the transaction proceeds, I guess the other things to be aware of is to check that your bank can do a bank transfer for you. Some banks will only allow up to a certain amount, so 10, 20, 25,000 by by an internet banking transfer. You might have to attend the bank to do a telegraphic transfer to actually transfer the deposit and any amounts that may need to be sent across. So it's good to get things in order. It's also good to check if you've got your money on a deposit scheme. It may be that you've got it on a savings account and there's a notice period on that. So it's always good to get your financial situation illustrated right at the start. Make sure that you'll be able to draw down your money as quickly as you can. In terms of your mortgage advance, that's dealt with by the conveyancer. That's not something you need to worry about, but it's just something that you should be aware of insofar as your deposit and the balance is concerned. So as a first time buyer, there are also a lot of government schemes. The main one for first time buyers is the Help to Buy ISA scheme. I say the main one, that's the sort of access to everyone. Now that is provided by a bank, and through the bank you then deposit your money. I think you can make an initial payment of about £1,600 and then £200 a month, but what the government do is on completion they will provide you with an extra 25% of what you've already saved, up to a maximum of £3,000. So if you were to save £12,000, they will give you £3,000. That then increases your deposit to £15,000, and that's per person. So if there's a couple, you could potentially get an additional £6,000, and there's no charge against your property. There's nothing that needs to be paid back. It's all just towards the price. And it's a government initiative as a contribution. There are other schemes out there, equity loans, especially for new builds and things like that. So they're also worth considering, and you can get full advice on those from either your financial advisor in the first instance, but the conveyancer will also give you a full indication of that as well. So really, that's everything you should consider provisionally as a first-time buyer. There's been no questions to come up at the moment. Let me just have a check. No, so there's been no questions. Hopefully that's informative to everyone. If you have any questions, as always, please do contact me. If anything I've discussed you're not too sure on, then please, there'll be words, terminology used, like restrictive covenants, things like that you won't be sure of, and no one's born with the knowledge, so please feel free to ask. There's no obligation. I'm not worried if you've instructed someone else. It's just to give everyone an avenue to actually get the help they need without the worry, really. So if you have any questions, as always, please come back to me. Watch out for my blogs and further information coming up over the course of the next couple of weeks. And yes, one more thing I wanted to mention. In the last week or so, I've been involved in a local charity here, which is helping old people New Forest. And basically, it's based in New Milton. They have a charity shop, and they also give advice and assistance to people who are isolated or vulnerable, or basically the elderly community that needs an extra bit of support. So what I've done is I've agreed to offer them free legal advice, but they're also running a befriending service. So if anyone in this local area has a couple of hours that they might have free every now and again, that you might feel that you want to donate to towards this charity, just time, no money, to help elderly people either in need or who are isolated. So it's their befriending service. So it's on their website. You can find it on Google. It's Hope for short, but helping older people in the New Forest, and anything you can do to support them is very much appreciated. I do a lot of work with the elderly community, and I do see a lot of people who are very isolated. So any help you can offer is great. That's all from me. I won't bore you anymore. So it's me, Lucy Beck, the lawyer who listens. Thank you.